In 711, a general stood on a rocky cliff at the edge of Europe, looked at his army, and reportedly said, "Behind you is the sea, before you is the enemy. You have nothing left but your faith and your swords." Then he burned his own ships. What followed wasn't just a battle. It was the opening move of an 800-year war, the longest religious conflict in human history. This is the Reconquista. To understand how a continent nearly changed hands, you need to understand how broken Europe was in 711. The Roman Empire had collapsed 2 centuries earlier, and the Iberian Peninsula, modern-day Spain and Portugal, was ruled by the Visigoths. On paper, a wealthy Christian kingdom. In reality, a kingdom rotting from the inside. The nobles despised each other. Half of them weren't even sure their own king, Roderick, was a legitimate king. The army was large, but loyalty was thin. To the south, across the narrow strait of water, sat a very different story. The Umayyad Caliphate was the world's superpower. Their empire stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the mountains of Persia. They had spent decades steamrolling across North Africa, overrunning Byzantine fortresses, absorbing Berber tribes, and building an unstoppable military machine fueled by the concept of jihad. Holy war to spread Islam into every land not yet under their rule. By 711, the Umayyad governor of North Africa, Musa bin Nusair, had tens of thousands of Berber recruits hungry for a real fight. He looked north across the water at the crumbling Visigothic kingdom and saw opportunity. A Berber general named Tariq bin Ziyad crossed the strait with roughly 7,000 men. They landed on a steep rocky cliff that would one day bear his name, Jabal Tariq, Gibraltar. King Roderick, busy managing his own court politics, dismissed it as a minor raid. He was wrong. The 2 armies met near a river in the south. Roderick arrived in full royal armor, commanding a massive force that outnumbered the invaders 3-1. It should have been over quickly, but half his nobles were actively rooting for him to fail. Mid-battle, entire divisions switched sides or simply walked away. Roderick's chain of command collapsed. His smaller, faster, more motivated enemy tore through the chaos. Roderick's body was never recovered. Some said he drowned in the river. Others said the cavalry finished him. Either way, the king was gone, and with him, the Visigothic kingdom that had stood for 300 years. Tariq didn't stop. Within months, Cordoba, Granada, and Toledo, the Visigothic capital, all fell. Governor Musa, stunned that his general had conquered an entire kingdom without permission, rushed north with his own army to supervise. By 718, just 7 years after that first landing, nearly the entire Iberian Peninsula was under Muslim control. They renamed it Al-Andalus. The Christians probably had another name for it that we can't repeat here. The Umayyads weren't done. Their divine mission demanded expansion, and the next target was obvious: the Frankish kingdom to the north, modern-day France. In 720, Muslim armies crossed the Pyrenees and pushed deep into what is now southern France. They captured Narbonne, raided Bordeaux, and began moving toward the heart of Gaul. The Franks were nervous. The man tasked with stopping them was Charles Martel, not a king, but the military strongman who actually ran the kingdom. When he heard the Muslim armies were pillaging their way north from Bordeaux, he made his move. In 732, the 2 sides met between Tours and Poitiers in one of the most consequential battles in European history. The Muslim cavalry was fast, experienced, and devastating. Charles responded with discipline. He positioned his infantry on a wooded hill, formed a dense shield wall, and waited, not for hours. For an entire week, both armies stood facing each other. When the Muslims finally attacked, wave after wave broke against the Frankish wall. Then, in the chaos, the Muslim commander was killed. That single moment unraveled everything. The Muslim army retreated south under cover of darkness. Charles Martel, now nicknamed the Hammer, had stopped the advance cold. The Muslims called it a tactical retreat. The Christians called it a miracle. Everyone agreed that invading France wasn't worth it. But here's what often gets forgotten. While all this was happening in the north, a tiny, almost laughable act of resistance had already begun in the mountains of northern Iberia. His name was Pelayo, a Visigothic noble who had watched his kingdom fall, his fellow nobles defect and his churches burn, and simply refused to submit. He gathered a few hundred followers Ex-soldiers, stubborn farmers, monks, anyone who could hold a sword. They retreated into the mountain valleys of Asturias and declared themselves a kingdom. It was more like a handful of huts, a church, and one very optimistic cave, but it was independent, and that made it dangerous. The Umayyad sent a force north to crush it quickly, just another tax collection run. They marched into a narrow mountain pass called Covadonga. Pelayo and his men were waiting in the cliffs above. Rocks, arrows, and what we can only imagine was a great deal of cursing rained down. The Muslim force fled. It wasn't a major battle. The armies were small, the territory unchanged. But the story spread. The Battle of Covadonga became the founding myth of Christian resistance. Pelayo was crowned the first king of Asturias, and the Reconquista had its beginning. For the next 2 centuries, both sides consolidated. Al-Andalus became something extraordinary. When the Umayyad Caliphate was violently overthrown back in Damascus in 750 by a rival dynasty, the Abbasids, one surviving Umayyad prince, fled west, crossed the Mediterranean, and landed in Spain. His name was Abd al-Rahman. He took power, declared himself Emir of Córdoba, and turned Al-Andalus from a distant colony into an independent Muslim state. Under his successors, Córdoba became one of the most advanced cities in the world. Libraries that dwarfed anything in Christian Europe. Irrigation systems, algebra, architecture, philosophy. Christian scholars from the north quietly came south to study. The south was thriving. Meanwhile, the north was grinding. Pelayo's successors pushed slowly out of Asturias, west into Galicia, east into Leon. Small steps. More land reclamation than conquest. But each hill retaken was woven into holy propaganda, proof that God was still on their side. By the late 800s, new kingdoms had formed along the northern spine of Iberia. Castile, Navarre, Aragon, each with its own kings, its own feuds, and one shared obsession, push south. Then in 1009, the south did something the north could never have planned. It destroyed itself. After the death of Al-Andalus's greatest rulers, Córdoba collapsed into a brutal civil war. Within 2 decades, the powerful caliphate had shattered into dozens of Taifas, small, independent Muslim city-states constantly fighting each other. The Christians smelled it immediately. What followed wasn't a glorious charge. It was a centuries-long chess match of sieges, raids, marriages, and betrayals. And in perhaps the most remarkable twist, some of the Taifa rulers paid Christian kings for protection. Muslim princes were literally funding the armies that were praying for their downfall. By 1085, Castile had emerged as the dominant Christian force. King Alfonso VI captured Toledo, the ancient Visigothic capital, the symbolic heart of the peninsula. The Reconquista wasn't a legend anymore. It was happening. The Taifas panicked and sent for help. From across the strait came the Almoravids, a hardline Muslim dynasty from North Africa, mounted, disciplined, and deadly serious about Islam. In 1086, they crushed Alfonso VI at the Battle of Sagrajes and halted the Christian advance for a generation. But power corrupts fast on the Iberian Peninsula. The Almoravids softened within decades and were replaced by an even stricter movement, the Almohads. The Almohads were formidable. They rebuilt the Southern Empire and pushed north hard. In 1195, they handed the Christians another devastating defeat. For a moment, it looked like the Reconquista might be reversed entirely. Then came 1212. For once, briefly, remarkably, the Christian kingdoms united. Castile, Aragon, Navarre, along with crusaders from France, converged on the Almohad army at Las Navas de Tolosa in the hills of Andalusia. The battle was brutal, chaotic, and decisive. The Christians broke through the Almohad camp and shattered their army. It was, as many scholars have called it, the true turning point. After Las Navas de Tolosa, Al-Andalus never recovered its strength. The Christian kingdom swept south. Córdoba fell in 1236. Valencia in 1238. Seville in 1248. Muslim Spain was almost gone. Almost. One city survived. Granada, tucked beneath the Sierra Nevada mountains, became the final jewel of Al-Andalus. Its rulers, the Nasrids, were masters of political survival. They paid tribute to Castile. They negotiated. They made themselves just useful enough to be tolerated. For 200 more years, Granada held on, but every rope phrase eventually. By the late 1400s, Castile and Aragon had merged through the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic monarchs. Together, they commanded the most powerful unified kingdom in Iberian history. Granada was the last item on their list. In 1482, they launched a 10-year military campaign, fortress by fortress, valley by valley, closing the noose around the city until there was nowhere left to run. On January 2nd, 1492, beneath the shadow of the Alhambra Palace, the last Muslim ruler Granada handed over the keys of the city to Ferdinand and Isabella. After 781 years, the Reconquista was over. The crescent was lowered. The cross was raised. Spain was whole. Or at least that's what they told themselves. Because 1492 didn't just mark the end of one war. It marked the beginning of something else entirely. That same year, a Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus sailed west under the Spanish flag, carrying the same fire of conquest that had burned across Iberia for 8 centuries. The Reconquista was over. The age of conquest had just begun.